Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. As we continue our discussion of the years 1920 to 45, in this next series of lectures, we're going to be taking a closer look at the Depression years through the lens of groups at the periphery. Groups like blacks, women, Native Americans, Mexicans, and others who were marginalized in their day and, to one degree or another, have often been marginalized by historians. So in some cases, we've talked about these episodes in previous lectures in broad strokes, and in the next couple of lectures, we're going to be looking at them more closely. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the so-called New Deal for blacks and race in the New Deal era. And as I've mentioned in previous lectures, one of the criticisms that has been put to FDR and the New Deal is that it didn't treat the races equally and in some ways clearly favored whites over blacks. And so this is a criticism that we need to think a little bit more carefully about. And I'll be mentioning in some of the future moments in this lecture that FDR, Eleanor Roosevelt, and a number of the other core New Dealers themselves favored equality for blacks. No serious historian accuses them personally of being racist, but a number of the ways in which the New Deal programs were implemented were racist. But we need to think a little bit about some of the cultural headwinds that confronted FDR and the New Dealers who might have wanted to achieve more in terms of racial equality. And certainly, they would have been well ahead of their time if they had pursued racial equality more aggressively. Bear in mind that the civil rights movement itself is really still about a generation away from getting kicked off. And while we understand that FDR had sweeping popularity across the entire country, and the electoral maps of his victories in the elections in 1932 and 36 consume almost the entirety of the electoral map, we don't have to go back much farther in history to realize the full extent to which the Democratic Party depended on the Solid South for its support. This is known as the Southern Strategy, and Democrats really relied on the South in large measure leading up to the FDR years. You might look, for instance, at the electoral map pictured on the screen from 1924, in which the Republican Calvin Coolidge defeated the Democrat John W. Davis. Davis's support is depicted in the map in blue. And so it's very clear that almost the entirety of Democratic support originated from the South. But what does all of this have to do with race and the New Deal? It simply points to the origins and background of that Democratic support, which was rooted in the South. And so FDR, despite having wide support across the country, was concerned that supporting civil rights action too aggressively might lose him his core support in the South itself. We'll talk more about that just a little bit further in the lecture. We can also see evidence of some of the cultural headwinds that confronted the New Dealers in the difficulties of the anti-lynching campaign and the fact that our nation never did pass an anti-lynching law. This despite the fact that one of FDR's first fireside chats was devoted to his support for an anti-lynching law. But he was pretty quickly reined in after that, and Southern politicians reminded him that supporting such a law might cost him his much-needed support in the South. And so he rarely raised the issue of an anti-lynching law again after that. Nonetheless, FDR and the New Dealers were opposed to racism, and most programs were extended to minorities, and blacks and other minorities did participate in most of the New Deal programs, particularly the public works programs, and FDR actually signed an executive order that prevented segregation and racial discrimination in the New Deal programs. There were some limitations to that, however. As I've mentioned in previous lectures, social acts like the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act did not apply to domestic workers and had some other limitations as well. And as I described in a previous lecture, the Agricultural Adjustment Act provided payments to landowners in the South, but didn't do anything to try to help sharecroppers or tenant farmers, many of whom were black. Perhaps most famously, though, as a signal of his interest in racial equality, FDR, at Eleanor's urging, established the Federal Council of Negro Affairs, which was commonly referred to as the Black Cabinet. FDR's commitment to equality for blacks was more than just lip service. FDR appointed far more minorities to important positions than any previous president, and by the mid-1930s there were some 45 African Americans appointed to important posts within the New Deal agencies and other parts of the government. While not officially members of the president's cabinet itself, they came to be called the Black Cabinet or the Black Brain Trust, and they did hold many important offices within the government. They also advised FDR on various issues related to black employment, education, and other civil rights issues. Among the most prominent of these appointees was Mary McLeod Bethune, who was named director of the National Youth Administration's Office of Minority Affairs, the first time an African American woman had led a federal agency. We'll be talking more about Bethune a little bit later in these lectures. Another very important representation of FDR's commitment to equality was the role of the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, which can't be understated in this period. If FDR had to be sensitive to the political realities of the Southern strategy, Eleanor could be more open in her opinions about race and equality and could certainly pull FDR in the direction that she wanted to go. If FDR had his fireside chats to address the public, Eleanor's equivalent was a newspaper column called My Day, which ran in papers around the country for many years during the Depression era. Eleanor, it seemed, never missed an opportunity to make her opinions known about racial equality, and she made many important symbolic acts throughout her time as First Lady, including many public appearances and speeches, a number of which have gone down in history as important moments in this era. In 1935, she attended an art exhibit hosted by the NAACP titled A Commentary on Lynching that focused on the suffering of blacks in the Jim Crow South. Later, in joining a fundraiser for the NAACP, she said, "We should all have equal rights, and minorities should certainly have them exactly as majorities do." She called for the integration of hospitals in the South and demanded that funding for black schools be equal to that provided to white schools. She also was a friend to many black leaders and public figures of the day, including Mary McLeod Bethune, whom we've just talked about, Walter White, who was the executive director of the NAACP, and the famous singer Marian Anderson. It was her friendship with Anderson that led to one of Eleanor's most famous moments in the realm of civil rights and equality. Anderson had performed at the White House for the Roosevelts before, and in 1939 Eleanor Roosevelt invited her to perform in Washington's Constitution Hall. But the organization that controlled that venue, the Daughters of the American Revolution, refused to rent the hall for the event, knowing that an African American would be performing. Incensed, Eleanor resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution, sending them a letter and writing one of her columns in My Day, circulated around the nation, a huge embarrassment for the organization. In her letter, Eleanor wrote, "I'm afraid that I have never been a very useful member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, so I know it will make very little difference to you whether I resign or whether I continue to be a member of your organization. And at that point, she resigned, which of course mattered a great deal to the organization. It was a huge embarrassment for them. Eleanor then went on to help arrange a huge performance by Marian Anderson at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday, 1939, attended by a crowd of more than 75,000 blacks and whites. And later that year, at the NAACP National Convention in July, Eleanor attended to personally present the famous Spring Iron Medal to Marian Anderson at that ceremony in Richmond, Virginia, and that's what you see pictured here. Incidentally, Eleanor's activism continued into the war years and even beyond, and we'll address these later in the semester, but I would want to mention that during the war years when A. Philip Randolph and others threatened to organize a march on Washington if the president refused to desegregate the armed forces, Eleanor helped to broker an agreement between FDR and African American leadership, and FDR issued an executive order in which he desegregated the defense industries on the home front. Eleanor continued to agitate for desegregation of the military itself, the armed forces, and that actually did happen in 1947 under the Truman administration after FDR had passed away. So Eleanor was actually a huge part of the popularity of the FDR administration with African Americans. And it was actually Roy Wilkins, the NAACP leader, who described the relationship this way, saying that FDR was a friend of Negroes only insofar as he refused to exclude the Negro from his general policies that applied to the whole country, whereas Mrs. Roosevelt was the Negro's true friend. The personal touches and the personal fight against discrimination were Mrs. Roosevelt's. That attached to Roosevelt also. He couldn't get away from it, and he reaped the political benefits from it. With that said, there certainly was discrimination within the New Deal programs and the way they were administered, even if the New Dealers themselves did not intend discrimination. Most of them were conducted locally, and so local offices of the various New Deal organizations might discriminate as they wished. And as I've mentioned, the Agricultural Adjustment Act did not apply to tenant farmers or sharecroppers equally, and they didn't reap any of the benefits of the payments that went to the landowners. The NRA, as well, didn't apply to agricultural workers or domestic workers, and so blacks often didn't receive equal benefits there as well. And the phrase went down in this era that blacks were often the last hired and the first fired, even within the New Deal programs. As a final example of the kind of tilted scales racially during the Depression years, I want to return to the Scottsboro Boys and their case, which I've described in a previous lecture. In this episode, 9 black boys were arrested for the rape of 2 white women on a train, even though at least one of the women later came out and said that they had made up the story. But they were all held in prison for a time, some of them for extended periods of time. In fact, many years. But in the time that they were imprisoned, some of their cases did create important precedents during that time. In the case of Powell versus Alabama in 1932, it was determined that defendants must have adequate time to prepare for capital defense. And in Norris versus Alabama in 1935, it was ruled that trials with juries systematically created to exclude blacks were illegal. And so even though these boys were treated unfairly, and a number of them served very long prison sentences for a crime they didn't commit, there were some instances where their cases did start to create change within the legal system. Despite some of those gains, it really will be about another generation before we start to see significant chinks in the legal armor in cases like the Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954.
you.